Oh, so far in the cockpit. Oh, crap, fire!
7 days ago, 4 human beings climbed into a spacecraft named Integrity and left Earth behind. And right now, as you are watching this, they are no longer part of our world in the way we understand it. They are not standing on land. They are not breathing air that belongs to Earth. They are suspended in a place that does not forgive mistakes. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen. 4 names, 4 lives, 4 people moving through the silence between worlds, farther from home than any human has traveled in over half a century. Inside that spacecraft, everything matters. Every bolt, every wire, every seal, every line of code, every calculation, every assumption. Because out there, nothing catches you if you fall. And here's the truth, most people don't want to sit with for too long. Every single system keeping them alive right now exists because someone else didn't survive long enough to need it. Not because it worked perfectly the first time. Not because it was designed flawlessly, but because something failed. And someone paid for that failure, with their life. We don't talk about that part very often. We don't talk about what it really costs to leave this planet. We celebrate the launch, the spectacle, the controlled explosion beneath a rocket, powerful enough to escape gravity itself. We watch the flames, the smoke, the vibration, the moment where physics is pushed to its absolute limit, and we call it progress. We call it advancement. We call it human achievement. But what we don't see is everything that had to go wrong before that moment could go right. Because the road to Artemis II was never built on success. It was built on correction, on failure, on warnings that came too late, on decisions that should have been different, on names that most people will never hear, and on people who never came home. Artemis II did not begin in 2026. It did not begin with a rocket standing on a launch pad or a countdown clock ticking towards zero. It began almost 60 years earlier, on a quiet evening in January 1967, inside a spacecraft that wasn't even supposed to fly. It was supposed to be routine, a test, a rehearsal, nothing more. 3 astronauts sat inside the Apollo 1 command module on Launch Complex 34 in Florida. They weren't going anywhere. The rocket beneath them was inactive. The mission wasn't scheduled to launch that day. This was just practice. Gus Grissom sat in the left seat, a veteran astronaut who had already flown in both the Mercury and Gemini programs. He had seen space. He understood the risks. He knew how fragile everything was. Ed White sat beside him, the first American to walk in space, a man who had once refused to come back inside his spacecraft because he didn't want to leave the view behind. Roger Chaffee sat to the right, the youngest of the 3, preparing for his first mission, carrying years of training and anticipation for a moment he had not yet reached. They were sealed inside the capsule. The hatch was closed. The environment inside was pressurized with pure oxygen. At the time, it made sense. Pure oxygen simplified the system. It reduced weight. It was easier to manage. On paper, it worked. In theory, it was efficient. In reality, it turned the spacecraft into something else entirely. Because pure oxygen does not behave like the air we breathe. It doesn't burn slowly. It doesn't give you time. It accelerates everything. It feeds fire in a way that turns the smallest ignition into something unstoppable. The test had already been frustrating. Communication issues, delays, small problems stacking on top of each other. Grissom, irritated, had already complained over the radio about how difficult it was to communicate even between buildings on the ground.
Now we gotta get to the moon. We can't talk between 3 buildings.
At 6:31 p.m., a spark ignited beneath Grissom's seat. No explosion at first, just a flash. But in a pure oxygen environment, that was enough. The fire spread instantly. Materials that would barely smolder under normal conditions ignited violently. Velcro, nylon, foam, everything inside the cabin became fuel. The temperature rose almost immediately. The pressure increased. The air itself became toxic. Chaffee's voice came over the radio. There was fire, and then there was silence. Inside the capsule, White tried to open the hatch, but the hatch was never designed for this moment. It required multiple steps. It required time. It required calm. And there was no time. There was no calm. The pressure inside the cabin pushed against the hatch, sealing it tighter. The fire consumed the oxygen that was supposed to keep them alive. The smoke filled their lungs. The heat overwhelmed everything. Outside, technicians rushed toward the capsule. They tried to help. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. They couldn't get in. By the time they forced the hatch open, 5 minutes had passed. Inside, all 3 men were dead. And what followed changed the future of spaceflight forever. Because when investigators began to examine what had happened, they didn't find one mistake. They didn't find one failure. They found 1,400 separate issues, design flaws, material risks, engineering compromises, warnings that had been documented, concerns that had been raised, problems that had been known and not fixed. That's when the realization hit. The danger wasn't just in the machine. It was in the mindset. NASA had been moving too fast. They had been chasing a deadline. They had been focused on reaching the moon before anyone else. And in that race, they had started to accept things they shouldn't have accepted. They had started to ignore things they shouldn't have ignored. They had convinced themselves that progress justified risk, until that risk became real. So, they stopped. Everything stopped. For 20 months, the Apollo program shut down. No launches, no missions, no progress, only investigation, only redesign, only reflection. They changed everything. The hatch was redesigned to open outward, quickly, in seconds. Flammable materials were removed. Wiring was improved. Procedures were rewritten. The atmosphere inside the cabin was changed. The spacecraft was rebuilt from the inside out. And 2 years later, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, a moment that would be remembered as one of the greatest achievements in human history. But that moment did not belong only to the men who stepped onto the lunar surface. It also belonged to the men who never left the ground, because without them, it would not have been safe enough to try again. And yet, even that lesson wasn't enough. Because 3 months later, on the other side of the world, another astronaut climbed into a spacecraft that was already known to be in trouble. Vladimir Komarov. Soyuz 1 was not ready. That wasn't speculation. That wasn't hindsight. It was documented. More than 200 technical issues had been identified before launch. Engineers had warned that the spacecraft was unstable, unreliable, dangerous. But the mission moved forward anyway. Because of pressure, because of politics, because of the need to demonstrate success, because failure was not acceptable. Komarov knew. He understood the risks. He understood what he was getting into. And he went anyway, because if he didn't, someone else would. For over a day, he fought the spacecraft in orbit. Systems failed. Controls malfunctioned. The vehicle became increasingly difficult to manage. But he kept it together long enough to attempt re-entry. He guided the capsule back toward Earth, and for a moment, it looked like he might survive. Until the parachute failed. The main parachute didn't deploy correctly. The backup parachute tangled. There was nothing left to slow the descent. The capsule fell, and it hit the ground at full speed. Komarov became the first human being to die during a space mission. And once again, the lesson was written in loss. Quality control improved. Manufacturing standards tightened. Testing became more rigorous. But again, it came after. After the failure. After the death. And still, it wasn't the last time. Because 4 years later, spaceflight would face one of its most silent and terrifying disasters. Not fire, not explosion, not impact, but something far quieter. Something almost invisible. A slow loss of air. Soyuz 11. 3 cosmonauts returning from the first space station ever placed in orbit. They had completed their mission. They had broken records. They had done everything right. And they were coming home. Until a small valve opened too early. A tiny component, barely noticeable, hidden beneath their seats. Air began escaping from the capsule. At first, there was no alarm loud enough to change the outcome. No immediate solution. They weren't wearing pressure suits, because there wasn't enough room, because the design required a compromise. 3 men, or protection, not both. Within seconds, the pressure dropped. Within moments, they lost consciousness. Within minutes, they were gone. And the spacecraft continued descending perfectly. The parachutes deployed. The landing was smooth. Everything appeared normal, until the hatch was opened, and the recovery team realized the truth. The mission had succeeded. The crew had not survived it. That moment changed something fundamental, not just in engineering, not just in procedure, but in how humanity understood the cost of leaving Earth. From that day forward, there would be no more compromise on pressure suits during critical phases of flight. No more trading safety for capacity. No more pretending that space could ever be made routine. Because space is not forgiving. It does not negotiate. It does not give second chances. And for a while, it seemed like those lessons had been learned. But then came a different kind of danger. Not a hidden valve, not a spark, not a broken parachute. Something far more subtle, something far more dangerous. Complacency. By the 1980s, spaceflight had started to feel normal. The space shuttle was introduced not just as a spacecraft, but as a system that would make access to space frequent, predictable, almost routine. It would take off, land, be refurbished, and fly again, and again, and again. Like an airplane. That was the vision. And for a time, it almost felt real. Launches became more frequent. The technology seemed reliable. The risks felt understood. And that's when the danger began. January 28, 1986. A cold morning in Florida. Colder than usual. Too cold. Engineers had already raised concerns the night before. The O-ring seals in the solid rocket boosters, critical components designed to contain extreme pressure and heat, might not function properly in low temperatures. They recommended delaying the launch, waiting just one more day. But the launch had already been delayed before. There was pressure. There was schedule. There were expectations. And somewhere in that decision-making process, something shifted. The risk was acknowledged, but it was also minimized because previous flights had shown signs of O-ring erosion, and nothing catastrophic had happened. So the erosion became acceptable, normal, expected. This is how failure hides, not in the unknown, but in the familiar. 73 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle Challenger broke apart in the sky. 7 people were on board: Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe, a teacher, a civilian, someone who had been chosen to represent the idea that space was now for everyone. Millions of people were watching live, students in classrooms, families at home. They saw the moment the sky split into fragments. They didn't fully understand what they were seeing, but they knew something had gone wrong. What followed was one of the most important investigations in the history of engineering, and it introduced a concept that still defines safety culture today: normalization of deviance. The idea that when a system shows signs of failure but continues to operate, people begin to accept that failure as normal. The warning signs don't disappear. They just stop feeling urgent. Until the day they matter, until the day they kill. Challenger was not just a technical failure, it was a cultural one. A failure to listen, a failure to act, a failure to respect what the data was already saying. And for a moment, it felt like that lesson would never be forgotten. But time has a way of softening memory, and systems have a way of drifting back toward risk. 17 years later, it happened again. February 1, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia. During launch, a piece of insulating foam broke away from the external tank and struck the left wing of the orbiter. It wasn't the first time something like that had happened. Foam strikes had been observed before, and again, nothing catastrophic had happened before. So the event was treated as acceptable, not ideal, but not critical. Engineers saw the data. Some raised concerns. Some asked for further analysis. Some even requested satellite imaging to inspect the damage more closely, but those requests were not prioritized because the system had worked before, because the risk felt understood, because nothing had gone wrong last time. 16 days later, Columbia began its re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. At first, everything looked normal. Telemetry was steady. The trajectory was correct. The vehicle was on schedule. Then small anomalies began to appear. Temperature readings slightly higher than expected. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, at least not at first. But inside the left wing, something was happening. Superheated plasma, the same plasma that forms around every spacecraft during re-entry, had found a way in, through the damage caused during launch, through a hole no one had fully investigated. And once it was inside, there was nothing to stop it. The internal structure began to weaken, then to fail, then to collapse. At an altitude of around 60 kilometers, traveling at hypersonic speed, Columbia broke apart over the United States. 7 more people died. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, Elon Ramon. 7 more names, 7 more lives, 7 more reminders that the lesson had not been fully learned. The investigation that followed reached a conclusion that was as devastating as it was familiar. The root cause of Columbia was the same as Challenger. Not just the foam, not just the damage, but the culture, the normalization, the acceptance of risk because it hadn't failed yet. And that is the moment where everything begins to connect. Because Artemis II does not exist in isolation. It exists because of everything that came before it. After Columbia, the shuttle program continued for a few more years, but its future was already decided. It would end, and something new would take its place. Something built differently. Something designed not just with better technology, but with a different philosophy. The Space Launch System, the Orion capsule. Not designed to feel routine, not designed to feel safe, but designed to be as safe as possible in a place that can never truly be safe. And that difference matters, because when Artemis I flew, uncrewed, it revealed something unexpected. The heat shield, one of the most critical systems on the spacecraft, showed signs of erosion beyond what engineers had predicted. Not failure, not catastrophe, but not acceptable either. And this is where the story changes, because in the past, that might have been minimized, explained away, accepted, normalized. But this time, it wasn't. The program paused. Engineers investigated, data was reanalyzed, simulations were updated, and the mission was delayed. Then, delayed again, and again. Years passed, schedules shifted, budgets increased, criticism grew. Why the delays? Why the cost? Why not move forward? Because this time, they remembered. They remembered what happens when you ignore a small anomaly. They remembered what happens when you accept a risk just because it didn't fail last time. They remembered Apollo 1, Soyuz 1, Soyuz 11, Challenger, Columbia. And they chose differently. That is what Artemis II represents. Not perfection, not certainty, but change. A change in how risk is understood, a change in how decisions are made, a change in what is considered acceptable. And even that is only part of the story, because the names we remember are only a fraction of the cost. There are others. Test pilots who died pushing aircraft beyond their limits, engineers killed in ground explosions, technicians lost during fueling accidents, workers whose names were never broadcast, never remembered, never known, but whose contributions are still present in every safety protocol, every checklist, every design decision. Because every system carries history, every improvement carries memory, and every layer of protection carries the imprint of someone who didn't survive long enough to benefit from it. Right now, as those 4 astronauts move through deep space, they are not alone. Not really. They are surrounded by everything we have learned, every failure, every correction, every moment where something went wrong, and someone chose to understand it instead of ignore it. The spacecraft they are inside, Integrity, is not just a machine. It is a record. A record of everything that has ever gone wrong in human spaceflight, and everything that was done to make sure it doesn't happen the same way again. The quick-release hatch exists because 3 men could not escape a fire. The pressure suits exist because 3 men lost air they could not replace. The booster redesign exists because seals failed when they shouldn't have. The heat shield caution exists because damage was dismissed when it should have been investigated, and the decision to wait, to delay, to stop exists because all of those moments proved something undeniable. That space does not care about deadlines, that physics does not respect schedules, that reality does not negotiate. So when Artemis II returns, when that capsule hits the atmosphere at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, when plasma surrounds it, when communication cuts out, when the world waits in silence for a signal that might not come for several minutes, understand what that moment really means. It is not just tension. It is not just anticipation. It is not just a mission reaching its conclusion. It is the accumulation of everything that came before. Because re-entry is where all of it is tested. The heat shield, the structure, the systems, the assumptions, everything. And for a few minutes, nothing can be changed. Nothing can be corrected. Nothing can be fixed. Only endured. Only survived. And if that signal returns, if the parachutes deploy, if the capsule lands, if the hatch opens, if 4 people step out alive, that moment will not just belong to them. It will belong to everyone who made it possible, everyone who failed, everyone who warned, everyone who tried, everyone who didn't make it. Because space exploration has never been safe, it has never been routine, and it never will be. But it has become something else, something more careful, more aware, more honest about the risks it carries. Not because we became perfect, but because we refused to forget. And if those 4 astronauts come home, it will not be the end of the story. It will be proof that the story is still being written. Not in certainty, not in comfort, but in the space between risk and understanding, between failure and learning, between loss and survival. A story that began long before they launched, and will continue long after they return. Because the path to the stars has never been a straight line. It is a path shaped by everything we got wrong, refined by everything we chose to fix, and carried forward by those who are still willing to go into the unknown, knowing exactly what it has already cost.